Okay, so we have this flash talk. We asked to the speakers to stay within the 10 minutes, so after the presentation we can have one or two questions just to make it more interactive. So we start with Tess Johnson. She comes from the University of Oxford, and the title is What You See in the First Slide. So please.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So today I will be presenting some work that I conducted primarily during my DPhil, which was on the ethics of human germline genome editing for enhancement. This work was conducted mostly at the Uehiro Center, but I'm now affiliated with the Ethox Center at Oxford. I'm a bioethicist by training, and I'm going to be examining two different approaches that are often taken, I should say, in secular bioethics to questions about how we should regulate and how we should treat this kind of possibility of technological development. And I think that we have a lot more work to do in this area. So I'll start off by just introducing germline genome editing, or GGE, specifically for enhancement, and then I'll look a little bit at the two different accounts. So I'll tell you a bit about what I mean by an individualist account and a bit about what I mean by a collectivist account. And I'll highlight a couple of issues with the ways that each of those accounts have been developed to date. And I'll suggest that we need a new approach. So germline gene editing for human enhancement, it's the use of these genetic tools that we've been talking about, like CRISPR-Cas9, well, there goes the cannon, to insert or alter or remove certain genes or change them so that we can change the traits, hopefully. And I'm sorry for any scientists, I'm a bioethicist, so there may be inaccuracies here, but I think you get what I'm talking about. Of course, at the moment, this isn't necessarily a proper possibility, certainly when we're talking about polygenic traits, but as I'm sure all of you are aware, we have seen a first kind of experiment with this in 2018. So this was done by the scientist He Jiankui in China, and there was this general attitude of public outrage that this had happened. You can actually think about what was done as an attempt at human enhancement, in fact, not just gene editing, because although the original goal that was stated by the scientist was to prevent a risk of exposure to HIV, or to confer resistance because there was risk of exposure to HIV for the two future children, that gene was also found later to be associated with memory and learning, and to confer potential benefit there. Now, of course, this was unsuccessful, and there was a moratorium agreed kind of following this event. But I think that we still need to be thinking in advance about how this technology should be regulated, and whether gene editing should be allowed, and whether it should be allowed for therapeutic uses or enhancement uses. And this question, really, I don't think that we have much of an answer. Part of that comes down to the approach that has been dominant to date, and I'm going to argue that that's an individualist approach, which doesn't allow us to look at the collective level that we need to look at for regulation. So when I'm talking about individualism, what I mean is asking questions about individual uses. So I'm thinking about the individuals as being a parent or two parents and a child. So what happens when a particular couple would theoretically decide to make use of this kind of a technology, and what would be the outcomes for them and potentially for the future child? And this is a very narrow lens, but this is what I think has been the dominant discourse to date. Often there are certain assumptions that come with this kind of approach as well. There's thinking about the individual as making their own decision in kind of a free market setting as well. And a lot of the debate has been about, well, you know, could a parent afford this? There hasn't been much talk about inclusion in, say, a public healthcare system or a publicly funded system. And most of the consequences that have been discussed are consequences for the parents and for the future child. I think that other than certain areas of discussion that I'll talk about in the section on collectivism, there hasn't been as much conversation about how this might affect people other than the future enhanced child and the parents. So these are the kinds of questions then that you ask when you're looking through an individualist lens. It's stuff like, should parents be able to use this technology? Like, should a set of parents be able to use it? Does it promote their reproductive or procreative autonomy? Is a parent who uses GGE playing God? I think that some of these later couple of questions kind of delve into the collectivist territory as well. If we're thinking about procreative altruism, you can, for instance, think about that. So procreative beneficence relates to doing the best thing, to having the best chance of the child that's going to have the best possible life. And procreative altruism is a principle that aims to expand this out to thinking about how that child will impact others, but it's still situated in this language of a duty that parents have. So we're talking about individual parental duties still. I think this is a very limited perspective. So instead, we might want to focus on a different alternative, such as collectivism. So this asks questions about collective use, not what happens if one set of parents use this technology one time, but rather what happens if this were perhaps accessible widely in a particular society, what would be the societal level outcomes, and how can we think about that decision making not as individuals, but how should regulators be thinking about this? How should any stakeholder communities with special interests, such as, for instance, those who are living with a certain condition, if we were talking about therapeutic changes, or living with a certain set of traits that were being considered to be that were considered candidates for editing out by a group of future people. How would those perspectives be taken into account, and what are those consequences on the societal level? So that leaves us asking a few different kinds of questions. We might ask about how whether parents should be allowed or encouraged to make these kinds of changes by a state. We might ask questions about whether this is a form of eugenics. We might ask how families, communities, and populations would be impacted, not just an individual future child. And we might ask what kinds of collective action problems might arise. Now, that's pretty promising so far as an approach. I think it seems more promising as a way to answer the question about how should we consider regulating this technology in the future. But it has a few problems as well. So first off, I think one big problem is the failure to challenge individualist assumptions. So although collectivism kind of positions itself as this response to a dominant individualist approach, it falls into some of the same pitfalls that an individualist approach does, in fact. So for instance, Sandel is sometimes considered to be something of a collectivist. He wrote this book, I've forgotten what, something perfection. Yeah, Against Perfection in 2007. And he was talking about some of these issues, but he was still assuming a landscape of individual choice. So although he was thinking about societal consequences, he was assuming that there was going to be this availability via the free market, and that this leaves him asking ethical questions kind of at a different level. And the same with Cass. Leon Cass has looked at this, and he has thought a bit about infeasibility of alternatives to free market availability. So we don't actually necessarily see that everywhere. I get that we're thinking about different kinds of health systems, but certainly there are alternative models that we can look at that don't make these kinds of assumptions, and that don't kind of only look at the don't only look at the individual level. Another set of issues relate to these ones down here. So I think that there's often a bit of a kind of negative slant that comes inbuilt into collectivism. I don't think that it is always a balanced approach, and I think that that is to its own detriment. You need to be coming from a neutral standpoint and then making an evaluation from that standpoint. And I think that, for instance, Robert Sparrow falls into this trap. He rejects the consideration of aggregate welfare, so thinking about how the welfare of a whole population might be affected by individual or population scale use of these technologies, because he says, well, you know, that's yeah, we shouldn't be thinking that way because that might justify anything. And then he takes this down a eugenics pathway. And I think that while he makes some really good points about the possibility of eugenics and the way that this could go, you can make that without coming in with an assumption that we shouldn't be considering aggregate welfare at all as something that could be in favor of using GGEE if we could produce societal level benefit. So I have investigated this a bit further in a paper from 2021. Have a read if you're interested. I also explore it much further in my thesis, where I talk about a possibility of a new approach, which very briefly is basically that we need to reform the way that collectivism works. And the way that we can do that is by looking to fields that already use these collective level ethical principles and concepts. And I think that the main way that we can do that is by looking at public health ethics. We see ideas about particular collective level duties. We see resource allocation questions. We see a lot of justice related concepts that aren't just keeping our focus on the question about what individual sets of parents should do. And that's the level that we need to be talking at if we want to actually make inroads on questions surrounding regulation. That's pretty much what I've said. So if you're interested in that, I also have a thesis on this from 2022. You probably don't want to read that, but there's a chapter-long version that summarizes it all very briefly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. This is an example of how the pluralistic approach to ethics can find a common ground to come together. Maybe there is a question from the audience.
It's only if you have considered one author, Habermas. I like his idea that if you are allowing this, you are the parents will take the biography of the individual. So, alias, in some sense, is the expression of freedom. So, if I am be perfectly designed from the beginning, my life will be something which is not in my hands. I like this idea of Habermas. I think is also Sandel. I think Sandel, talking about this topic, is very important about the rights and duties of the parents in the area of not only this comment about Habermas, which is old but very smart.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that's right. We do need a balance here. And you know, I don't want to say that there's no room for considerations about parental duties or effects on the future child as well. And I think that that's what I was trying to get at a bit with the sparrow point. It's not that we shouldn't be considering any trade-offs that might occur between like the well-being of the future child and those who that person might benefit in the future. But we need to have some kind of a balance. And I think that public health ethics it's just an area that's really used to doing that kind of work.
Thank you very much. We continue with the last flash talk. Tommaso Ropilato, working at the University of Turin.
Yep.
So, playing God or playing good? So, this is an intriguing title.
All right, so let's see if it works. All right. Could you put like full screen? All right, anything. So first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor, especially for a doctoral student, to have the opportunity to hear such high-level insight, especially in a setting like this. So I'm a doctoral student in philosophical and religious studies at the University of Turin. And today my goal is to share a suggestion, a really simple and brief suggestion, inspired by the reading of Bruno Latour's paper entitled A Cautious Prometheus. So this idea is to reframe the ethical debate on genetic engineering, and we can say more broadly on life itself, in terms of design. As we will see, this proposal is, of course, not merely a matter of terminology, but reveals far more substantial issues. So I would like to start from one of the most frequently used critique in the ethical debate surrounding genetic biotechnologies and synthetic biology, the playing God argument. So, as you probably all know, is an expression that conveys a deep concern about human overreach, suggesting an attempt to create life from scratch entirely by human means. So what I found particularly interesting in Latour's work is that he traces this mode of action, this posture, back to what he calls the engineering paradigm. That is a framework focused on controlling and mastering nature. And on the other hand, as suggested by the figure of the cautious Prometheus he evokes in his title, Latour advocates for an alternative approach grounded in humility and care, which he terms the designer paradigm. In his word, it is a model of praxis, which he describes as postmodernist, that emphasizes attentiveness to detail, context, and most importantly, the values we embed in our interventions. So rather than emulating Prometheus, I would say the designer aligns more closely with Daedalus, who abandons the relentless pursuit of knowledge and progress for its own sake, focusing instead on those strategies that reframe and in some sense resemanticize what already exists, with the ultimate aim of saving and being saved. So central to this design turn is the recognition that matter has been absorbed into conflicting meanings, and that signification and thus interpretation has become integral to our intervention in the world, within nature, and ultimately also on human ourselves. So it is a realization that leads us to another critical issue. If every aspect of our earthly existence can be redesigned, from the details of everyday objects to cities, cultures, and even bodies, and for this reason, if we now possess the capacity to judge whether things are well or poorly designed, we are entering in a realm that, where there are no longer mere matters of fact, but only matters of concern, each carrying significant political and moral weight. So this perspective, as we said, extends to our biological foundation as well. As reprogenetic biotechnologies bring about what Habermas has called an expansion of biological contingency, the question of moral good and bad becomes unavoidable even in the realm of coming into the world. A dimension that, perhaps even more than that of dying, has always been the most unavailable to human control. So, during my first year of PhD, building on these insights from Latour, I began to explore other facets of this emerging philosophy of design. And under the guidance of my advisor, Maurizio Balistreri, which I have to thank, I eventually encountered value-sensitive design theory. Developed in the 90s within the field of engineering and computer science, the value-sensitive design theory offers a framework and a methodology for integrating human values throughout the technology design process. So central to this approach is the interplay between moral and technical imagination. And specifically, my doctoral project aims to rethink through VSD one of the cornerstones of bioethical and medical theory and practice, informed consent, in response to the novel challenges posed by genetic biotechnologies in the procreative context. So my goal is twofold: to address technical and procedural challenges, and to make the informed consent process more sensitive to the values, aspiration, and emotional complexities inherent in reproductive decision-making. So how does the VSD methodology apply to my goal, to my project? So the first step is the conceptual investigation. It is an initial phase in which the aim is to identify the key values, both traditional and emerging, that arise within the context of technology-mediated reproductive decisions. So the approach is, of course, inherently interdisciplinary, combining philosophical, bioethical, and legal studies to understand how the experience of parenthood is shaped by genetic information, thereby transforming the very notion of procreative agency. The second step is the empirical investigation. It is a phase that involves the gathering of data through interviews and focus group with the key stakeholders that have been identified as central. These include bioethicists, geneticists, clinicians, and of course prospective parents, but also family members and socially significant figures within cultural and religious communities. So the objective is to capture on-the-ground insights into the expectation, the concern, and the ambiguities surrounding the use of reprogenetic biotechnologies. And finally, we have the technical investigation. It is a phase that focuses on the effective design and implementation of a new model of informed consent. So for example, a technical aspect involves the visualization of genetic data, an area recently explored through studies on the use of interactive tools that allow for an effective and clear exploration of genetic information with a gradual level of detail, thereby facilitating truly informed decision-making. So, as clearly emerged, VSD method emphasizes that values such as well-being, justice, and autonomy should not be treated as mere afterthoughts or external critiques of technological advances. Instead, these values are fundamental to the design process itself, ensuring that progress serves not merely innovation for its own sake, but the broader well-being of society. It opens up space for ethical reflection on the values we want our technologies to embody, centering our decision-making in terms of collective and ethical deliberation. I'm thus especially pleased to be speaking after Tess, whose work has significantly contributed to this topic. So to conclude, I would like to return to Latour and share his invitation to create hybrid forums for discussion around the issues that most deeply engage us as humans today. In light of the increasingly precise and accessible options for genome sequencing, particularly regarding the promises of reproductive biotechnologies, I believe that discussion on genetics and human enhancement deserve a seat alongside other pressing global issues like climate change, conflict, artificial intelligence, and migration. Therefore, rather than framing our debate as a question of whether we are overstepping natural and human boundaries, we might instead ask, how can we design biotechnologies to promote both human and ecological well-being? How can we ensure that the future of gene editing and synthetic biology reflects our deepest ethical and social values? By asking this question, I believe we can shift from concern about playing God to embracing our role as designer of a just and flourishing future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tommaso, with this complex approach to different issues. Alberto.
Thank you. Brilliant. I'm particularly interested in the informed consent challenge. Mm-hmm. And actually, we have been working even with Laura Parazzani for a long time on a better proposition of an informed consent for vaccine studies, for example, which is a different topic. However, the problem is that getting the information, the feedback from the public is extremely important, always disregarded. Nobody does that. Informed consent forms are usually made by lawyers instead. That's one thing. I appreciate the effort to include a design perspective in doing the informed consent, which is also something that we should learn. But I want to challenge you about the function that you can use with ChatGPT. I don't know if you had experience with that. We were amazed by the brilliant solutions that ChatGPT made in simplifying and adapting the content, which is always technical, of an informed consent, to different profiles of the public, which is a matter of study, because there are several publications endorsing the possibility that, supporting the possibility that this tool might be useful for enhancing and improving the understanding of informed consent, which is what we do.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is a tool that can, in some sense, simplify and give the possibility to reach a level of understanding that is very different between persons. But I think that the most important things in informed consent, especially in genomic settings, is genetic counseling. So my question is, can ChatGPT replace genetic counseling? And my answer is not yet, probably never, in my opinion. So I think that, can be an important tool, but it never replace humans. So,
Thank you very much. Of course, we still have major questions about the title, Playing God. What kind of God we are talking about? Anyhow, thank you very much.